fellow travelers, and welcome to episode number 20 of The Apple and the Hero. My name is Sara Orfali, and today I would like to be your guide on the pathways of history. We keep on traveling the roads of the Roman Empire, meeting their heroes, their legends, and their kings. In the last episode, we've met Romulus, the first king of Rome. We saw how, during his life, thanks to his very unconventional and mostly unlawful choices by our standards, Rome went from small settlement full of cast-out males to one of the main players in the Latium region. Declaring Rome an asylum had brought Romulus the much-needed initial settlers, but as he surrounded himself with petty criminals, he also wondered about the future of his legacy. A kidnapping solved his women problem, but also plunged Rome into war with its neighbours. After 37 years of reign, his disappearance, whether by divine ascension or very human murder, put an end to his legendary reign. 7 kings in total would end up ruling Rome, from the 21st of April 753 BC, when Romulus dug the Pomerium, to sometime around the year 509 BC, when Tarquinius the Proud was deposed, and the Romans chose the Republic as the new way of governing themselves. In a way, to me, the 7 kings of Rome are very similar to the 6 wives of Henry VIII. As a child, I learned their names by heart, almost as a nursery rhyme. And while I do know some details about their characters and personalities, mostly those kings feel like caricatures, fixed characters in a play. The names are Romulus, Numa Pompilius, Tullus Hostilius, Ancus Marcius, Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, and Tarquinius Superbus. As you can see, they are a bunch of difficult names. Today, though, I would like to discover with you the people who might have lived behind those names. Despite what the ancient Romans seem to think, modern historians aren't quite sure that the 7 kings of Rome really existed. They might be just legends, characters in a story, each created for a purpose. In this episode, we're going to look for those purposes, and maybe we can find out if those names, so difficult to remember, were real people after all. Let me welcome you, my fellow travellers, to the story of the 7 kings of Rome. To be honest, in this episode we're going to meet just 6 of them. Romulus, in his role as the founder, and also by virtue of the fact that he was the only one with enough information about him, got his own episode. With the first king out of the way, comfortable in his new role as the god Quirinus, let's meet the second king, Numa Pompilius. When I mentioned that, for the most part, the 7 kings of Rome felt like caricatures created for a predetermined purpose, this is something really evident with the figure of Numa Pompilius. As a child, I was told that if the first king had given Rome its fame and territory with his bold ideas and his war campaigns, then the second one had given the city some much-needed stability with the creation of Rome's most important political and religious institutions. If Romulus had been the warrior king, then Numa was the priest king. At first, Numa Pompilius hadn't wanted the throne, refusing all the entreaties made by the Senate. His argument was that Rome was very much a city of war, and it needed a warrior king to rule over it. The Senate, though, couldn't be persuaded to look for another candidate. Maybe Romulus's last tyrannical years had made the senators wary of having another warrior king. Who knows? Unfortunately, we aren't given any detail about the Senate's choice. When it became clear to Numa that both the senators and the citizens seemed dead set in giving him the crown, much like Romulus had done before him, he requested a sign from the gods. only then he would wear the crown. The augurs were consulted, and the response was favorable. Numa Pompilius became the second king of Rome during the 4th decade of his life. The first decision he made was to dismantle the royal guard, ostensibly because he wanted to be seen as a citizen among citizens. More malign voices, though, declared that he had gotten rid of them due to their dubious loyalty. He also introduced to Rome the cult of the god Terminus, the god of boundaries. Romulus had never wanted to set Rome's boundaries, nor he had wanted his citizens to feel bound by anything. But Numa Pompilius was of a different idea. He set clear borders between Rome's territories and the neighbors, and he also made the Romans respect the laws and condemned violence. He is also credited with the invention of the Roman calendar, or at least for having organized Romulus's hodgepodge idea into something much more usable, and he is credited also with the establishment of the position of Pontifex Maximus. The Romans remembered him as a wise and pious king, blessed by the gods. Jupiter had given a favorable answer when Numa had asked the gods if he should take the crown, and he reiterated his favor during his reign. As a plague was raging on, an ancile, a brass shield, fell from the sky in front of the king. A voice from the heavens declared that Rome would be the mistress of the world as long as that shield was preserved and never lost or stolen. Thanks to this miracle, the plague was resolved. Given its importance to protect it, Numa had 11 other identical shields made, and he mixed the divine ancile with them, so that no one except the king would know which was the original. The ancile was one of the 7 Pignora Imperii, the pledges of rule, objects which, if properly preserved, would guarantee Rome's rule for eternity. Not only Numa was in pretty good standing with Jupiter, it was also said that he had a close relationship with the nymph Egeria, who the legends describe as divine consort and counselor to the king. The second king of Rome might also have been the one to give Rome its secret name, the one only known to the highest religious authority. Following a widespread tradition in antiquity, a city had to have 3 names. The public one, Roma. The religious one, Flora, used only in certain religious ceremonies, and the secret one, the one expressing Rome's real essence. Unfortunately, no one knows what was Rome's secret name. Apparently, the only one to have disclosed it, a guy named Quinto Valerio Serrano, was executed for it. Some historians think that the sacred name might have been Roma in reverse, so Amor. Numa Pompilius was said to have authored many sacred books on various different topics. The king had asked for them to be buried with him, deeming them too much for the people. According to Plutarch, they were found by accident centuries later, when the tomb was opened during a natural accident. In that occasion, they were read once again, deemed too inappropriate for disclosure, and burned. Honestly, I really wanted to know what was written in there. After 43 years of reign, well into his 8th decade of life, Numa Pompilius died of natural causes. It was time for the Senate to nominate another king. There seemed to have been some competition for the position of 3rd king of Rome. On one hand, Numa Pompilius Pontifex Maximus, Numa Martius. On the other, the grandson of Romulus's military commander Hostus Hostilius, Tullus Hostilius. In the end, the Senate decided for the latter. In open contrast with Numa Pompilius, Tullus Hostilius was a warmongering king. Some say even worse than Romulus. he had little to no regards for all the religious ceremonies that his predecessor had created, and he only wanted to prove Rome's superiority on the battlefield. The greatest achievement the historians have ascribed to him is the destruction of Alba Longa. If you remember the first episode of this deep dive, Alba Longa was the city founded by Aeneas' son, and one of his kings was Numitor, Romulus and Remus's grandfather. In a way, Rome and Alba Longa were considered sister cities. We're not exactly sure what prompted Tullus Hostilius to decide to subjugate the city. To be honest, the destruction of Alba Longa, while it did historically happen, can't be credited to Tullus Hostilius with any degree of certainty. On the contrary, archaeological evidence seems to suggest that the city was destroyed at a later date than the one given by Livy and other historians, and probably by the Latins themselves, not the Romans. But since no hard evidence for this can be found, the destruction of Alba Longa is still considered Tullus Hostilius' greatest triumph. While the third king of Rome would have been perfectly happy to go directly into battle with the Albans, thus showing off Rome's military superiority, the dictator of Alba Longa, Metzius Fulvetius, was of a different opinion. The official version states that Metzius Fulvetius thought that, as sister cities, Rome and Alba Longa shouldn't go to war with each other. But I personally think he didn't want to lose, since the Roman army was the strongest power in the region. In any case, he proposed a different solution. Rather than a pitched battle with full armies, a smaller 3 versus 3 battle. The winner of the battle would be the winning city. 2 sets of triplets were found, one in each army. What a coincidence! The Horatii brothers represented Rome, and the Curiatii brothers Alba Longa. In front of their armies, they fought bravely. The Horatii were quick to injure all 3 of the Curiatii brothers, but then the Curiatii felled 2 of the Horatii in quick succession. As only one Horatius remained, his name was Publius, the Romans started to despair. He was uninjured, yes, but alone, and while the Curiatii were all wounded, they still had the numerical advantage. Knowing this, Publius opted for a different strategy. Rather than face all 3 of his enemies head-on, he turned tail and ran in the opposite direction, forcing the Curiatii to chase after him. But by running after him, injured as they were, the Curiatii not only had separated from one another, but were also quickly running out of stamina. When he saw them staggering, Publius changed strategy once again. This time, he turned and ran directly towards one of his opponents, the least injured one, and slayed him. Before the 2 remaining brothers could regroup, Publius had killed another one, rebalancing the fight once again. It was now a 1 versus 1. While Publius was probably a bit winded by all of his running around, but still uninjured, the third Curiatius was badly hurt, both physically and mentally. Yet he still managed to shakily stand up to face Publius, only to be quickly slain by him. Since the last standing man was an Horatius, Rome was declared the winner. While Metzius Fulvetius accepted the result in that moment, he later allied himself with the Etruscans against the Romans. When Tullus Hostilius won against his new foe, Metzius Fulvetius was captured and condemned to death. He was attached to 2 chariots, which were then driven towards opposite directions. The results were quite fatal for him. What about Publius, though? He returned to Rome to a hero's welcome. What he didn't know was that just before the war, his sister Camilla had been engaged to one of the Curiazi. When she caught sight of the cloak she had lovingly woven for her fiancé, resting on her brother's shoulders, she realized what had happened. As she was overcome with grief, yelling her fiancé's name, Publius ran her through with a sword, loudly proclaiming that no self-respecting Roman woman should mourn an enemy of Rome. The hero turned murderer, yet another instance in early Rome's history of a sibling slaying a sibling, was immediately condemned to death. On the advice of the king, he and his family appealed to one of the popular assemblies. Since Publius was the last remaining son and heir of his family, his sentence was commuted. As punishment, the family was required to offer a sacrifice to the gods. With the destruction of Alba Longa and the inception of his populace, Rome grew again. More citizens meant more senators, and with the sudden new influx of members, the old building was soon considered too small. The building of a new senate, the Curia Hostilia, is considered the second greatest achievement of the reign of Tullus Hostilius. After 32 years on the throne, though, his extreme impiety came back to bite him. Around the year 641 BC, Rome started to be plagued by a series of weird problems. First, it was stones coming from the sky. Then a voice coming from the heavens loudly announcing a pestilence as punishment for the extreme impiety of the people. When even the king fell ill with this plague, everybody scrambled to find a solution. Up until that moment, Tullus Hostilius had not cared one whit about the gods. Bedridden with the plague, he decided that maybe he could try to appease them. Since he had little to no idea about what he was doing, he botched the most important ritual, the ceremony for Jupiter Elysius. The god himself manifested his disappointment and anger by striking Tullus Hostilius' house with lightning, incinerating the building and all who were inside, including the king. If you find it difficult to believe that the third king of Rome could have been killed by lightning, there is another version for you. In this one, much like in Romulus' second version of his disappearance, Ancus Marcius, king number 4, and some of his followers went to Tullus Hostilius' house, murdered everyone inside it, and razed the building down, in order to ensure there would be no heir to inherit the throne. Whatever the cause, the third king was dead. It was time for a new king. This time, the Senate didn't nominate a new king immediately. They appointed an interrex, an extraordinary magistrate, who called an assembly of the people, who then elected a new king, Ancus Marcius. Since he had been elected by the people, it was widely believed that the fourth king of Rome was of plebeian origins. Still, Ancus Marcius had a very good pedigree. He was the son of Numa's Pontifex Maximus, the same who had lost the previous election against Tullus Hostilius, and of Numa Pompilius' daughter, making him the grandson of the second king of Rome. According to the legends, Ancus Marcius reigned both by waging war, like Romulus, and by respecting the gods, like his grandfather Numa Pompilius. A perfect mixture of the two. His first act was to have all the proper sacrifice and ceremonies clearly written down and fixed in every public space, so that no one would make another mistake like Tullus Hostilius. Apart from that, nothing particularly worthy of note happened during his reign, except for the fact that he slowly but steadily expanded Rome's borders by defeating and subjugating the neighboring kingdoms one by one. After 24 years of reign, he reportedly died of natural causes. An intrigue caused by Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, a member of Ancus Marcius' court and later king number 5, ensured that his sons would be out of town at his death, so they couldn't inherit the throne. Once again, it's time to change king. The fifth king of Rome was called Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, or Tarquinius the Elder. He was of Etruscan origins, making him the first of a new dynasty of Etruscan kings. He might have been called Lucumo, but since Lucume is the Etruscan word for king, there has probably been some confusion between his name and his title. One of the things which have always remained impressed in my mind about this king was that he was filthy rich. He had inherited his father's fortune, but since his father had been of foreign origins, having been born and bred in Corinthus, in Greece, Tarquinius Priscus was excluded from all political offices in Etruria. His wife Tanakil, a cunning woman with the gift of prophecy, who would play a big role both in the reigns of Tarquinius Priscus and his successor Servius Tullus, advised him to relocate to Rome and try his fortune there. They hadn't even entered the city that an eagle swooped down to take Tarquinius Priscus's cap from his head, and then, after a loop, the eagle returned it where it belonged. This event was interpreted by Tanakil as a very good omen. She told her husband he would become king. If it isn't clear to you why Tanakil made such a prediction, remember that the eagle was considered Jupiter's sacred animal, and by taking off the cap and putting it back on, it was basically prophesizing the crown which would be put on Tarquinius Priscus' head in the future. Still, when Tanakil and Tarquinius Priscus arrived in Rome, Ancus Marcius was still solidly holding the throne. Rather than try a coup, Tarquinius Priscus decided to go on living his own life and soon became known for his courtesy. Tales about this extraordinary individual reach also Ancus Marcius, who appointed him as his son's guardian. As Ancus Marcius lay dying, it was Tarquinius Priscus who sent his sons away, and after the death of the fourth king, he directly addressed the Comitia Curiata, the Roman legislative assemblies, and convinced them to choose him as the fifth king of Rome. He is effectively regarded as the first one who successfully lobbied for this position. His first act as a king was, at least in my opinion, his best political triumph. He expanded the number of senators, arguing that if there were more people in the Senate who owed him their position, the entire institution would be more loyal. Considering that he reigned for 38 years without so much as a conspiracy against him, except for the one which actually killed him in the end, the idea might have had some merit. Since it was by now understood that Rome was a military power, Tarquinius Priscus decided to expand Rome's borders once again, and he did so by means of conquering the neighboring tribes. Until that moment, the Latins, the Sabines, and the Etruscans had had working peace treaties with Rome, which had allowed them to keep their own identities. During the reign of the fifth king of Rome, those tribes became fully Roman. Due to his great military successes, Tarquinius Priscus is also the king credited with the celebration of the first Roman triumph. A Roman triumph was a civil ceremony together with a religious rite held to celebrate and sanctify the successes of a military commander. The victorious general would pass through the streets of Rome on a 4-horse chariot, wearing the toga picta and accompanied by a procession of war slaves and treasures he had amassed by looting the enemies. The ceremonies grew more lavish with the change from republic to empire, but it all started here during the reign of Tarquinius Priscus. He is also credited with the building of the Circus Maximus, the largest stadium in Rome for chariot racing, and with the construction of the Cloaca Maxima, which is possibly a slightly less glamorous infrastructure, but it's just as, if not more important than the Circus Maximus, given that the Cloaca Maxima was the main line of the sewers. After 38 years of peaceful reign, Tarquinius Priscus came across his first and last conspiracy against him. It was an assassination attempt orchestrated by the sons of Ancus Marcius, those who had felt that the throne should have gone to one of them almost 4 decades before. They arranged the king's assassination disguised as a riot, and Tarquinius Priscus ended his days with an axe in his head. This time, though, the power didn't immediately go back to the Senate to nominate another king. Tanakil, the king's wife, gave out that the king had only been wounded and used that time to install her protégé, Servius Tullius, on the throne. And so here we are, on king number 6. In my opinion, after Romulus, Servius Tullius is the most interesting one. In a way, his story follows very closely the story of the founder of Rome. There is no twin brother to be murdered here, though. According to Livy, Servius Tullius' mother, Ocrisia, was a Latin princess taken prisoner by the Romans and given to Queen Tanakil as a slave. As for his father, many versions describe Servius Tullius' father as divine, either one of the Lares, the gods protecting the home, or Vulcan himself. The most common version of the story associated with the birth of the 6th king of Rome depicts Ocrisia as a Vestal, just like Rhea Silvia. One night, as she was dampening the fire in the temple of Vesta, she was approached and impregnated by a disembodied phallus rising up from the earth. Logistics aside, the result was Servius Tullius. Despite being a slave, Ocrisia was of noble birth, so her son was given an honourable position in the king's household. He would later end up marrying Tarquinius Priscus' daughter, Tarquinia. His position later became even more prominent when rumours started to circulate around that some servant had seen a nimbus of fire hovering around his head as he was sleeping. For Tanakil, with her gift of prophecy, it was clear enough that all these signs pointed towards Servius Tullius being destined for greatness. Having married the king's daughter and having the favour of the king's wife made him very likely candidate to succeed Tarquinius Priscus upon his death. The sons of Ancus Marcius, though, were of a different opinion and tried to seize the throne by force, thus resulting in an axe to the head of the 5th king, as we've seen. By withholding the news of her husband's death, Tanakil managed to install Servius Tullius as regent first, and then, with a fait accompli worthy of a good movie, she persuaded the Senate to also give him the crown, thus making the 6th king of Rome the first one to have the ruling royal family's backing, but not the Senate. At least not willingly. So Tanakil's plan worked, and she went on to become one of the king's most loyal advisors. It's interesting to know that by choosing Servius Tullius, Tanakil had basically passed over her own 2 sons. Since one of them would end up being quite the tyrant, maybe she hadn't been completely wrong. Tanakil would go on to become an important figure in Roman history on her own merits. She was regarded by the Romans as the epitome of a good Roman wife. She was a model of womanly virtues, skilled in the domestic arts, and associated with various wedding customs. To her is attributed the traditional wedding formula, ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia. As you are Gaius, I am Gaia, which is taken to mean, wherever you will go, I will follow. Servius Tullius, though, wasn't Tanakil's creature. He might have owed her the throne, but he went on to gain the people's trust all on his own. Since his divine parentage was never fully disclosed or acknowledged, Servius Tullius is considered a plebeian king. That he was in favour of the plebs became clear as he churned out reform after reform, mostly aimed at the lower classes. This series of laws and amendments are known as the Servian reforms, and are thought to have laid part of the groundwork for Rome's shift from monarchy to republic. He didn't forget that Rome's strength lay in its military, adding territories and enlarging the city domains. Given the influx of new people in the city, both due to the military conquests and the social reforms, Servius Tullius is also accredited with the expansion of the city walls and the creation of a new moat. According to some historians, there is no consensus on this, his most important achievement is the creation of Rome's earliest minted coinage, done by pressing an image to the raw bullion. With a reign of over 44 years, he was the longest-serving Roman king, and his death was, at least in my opinion, just as interesting as his birth had been. Servius Tullius had 2 daughters, who he gave in marriage to Tarquinius Priscus's 2 sons. As the stories go, Tullia the Elder and Aruns Tarquinius were shy and withdrawn, while Tullia the Younger, yes, I know they have the same name, and Lucius Tarquinius were bold and opinionated. Of course, since Tullia the Elder was the first daughter, she was given to Lucius Tarquinius, the first son, while Aruns Tarquinius married Tullia the Younger. Unhappy with their respective spouses, Lucius Tarquinius and Tullia the Younger conspired to kill them, and then married each other. Unfortunately for Servius Tullius, though, the 2 scheming masterminds weren't yet finished. Their next step, a conspiracy to get rid of Servius Tullius himself and have Lucius Tarquinius inherit the throne with Tullia the Younger as his queen. First, Lucius Tarquinius appeared in front of the Senate to try and convince the senators to withdraw their support to Servius Tullius, because he had been born to a slave, the Senate hadn't really elected him, and he was favouring the lower classes by taking away from the wealthy. As Lucius Tarquinius was besmirching his character, Servius Tullius arrived at the Senate to defend himself, only to be pushed down the steps by his son-in-law and then murdered in the middle of the street. And then, to be completely sure he was dead, his daughter Tullia drove her chariot over her father's body. Servius Tullius's murder earned Lucius Tarquinius the crown, and the refusal to permit his father-in-law's burial gave him the sobriquet of Superbus, arrogant or proud, as he is known in English. The last benevolent king of Rome was dead. It was time for the 7th and final one. Reading through the stories of Tarquinius the Proud's reign, it becomes clear very quickly that he did everything a king should not do if he wants to keep the crown on his head or the head on his neck. Starting with the killing and then desecrating of his father-in-law, Tarquinius the Proud ran through the entire gamut of what not to do. Wary of those senators who might still have been loyal to his father-in-law, Tarquinius the Proud started a purge in the Senate. Those he killed were not replaced, and since he stopped consulting the Senate on most matters, he effectively diminished both its size and authority. Moreover, he started judging capital crimes without the advice of councillors, thus making the entire process discretionary and based on his mood. Even his foreign policy was sleazy and unfaithful toward his allies. When one of the Latin leaders with whom Rome had an alliance, Turnus Herdonius, invaded against Tarquinius the Proud and warned the other leaders against trusting the Romans, the king bribed the servant to put a large number of swords in Turnus' lodgings. So when Tarquinius accused him of plotting his assassinations, the planted swords served as evidence. When he decided to take over the Gabii, another Latin tribe that was Rome's ally, he resorted to yet another stratagem to prevail. He sent his son, Sextus, covered in wounds, to the city of the Gabii with a sob story about having been treated unfairly by his father. The Gabii not only took pity on Sextus, but welcomed him in their city with open arms, giving him the command of their troops. When Sextus sent a messenger to his father asking how he wanted the city delivered, Tarquinius reportedly said nothing, but kept striking off the heads of the tallest poppies in his gardens. His son apparently took the hint and picked off all the leading Gabii men, one by one, like poppies. He did do one good thing for Rome, though. He brought to the city 3 of the Sibyllane books, considered the most important collection of prophecies at the time. The only downside? The books were originally 9. When the Cumaean Sibyl offered all 9 of them to him, he refused to pay the asking price. Not particularly fazed, the Sibyl burned 3 books and then offered the remaining 6 at the same price. The king refused once again, and the Sibyl burned another 3 books and then proceeded to offer the last 3 books at the same price. At this point, Tarquinius the Proud actually bought the remaining 3. After 24 years of reign, a scandal involving his son Sextus brought down the curtain on both Tarquinius the Proud's reign and the entire Roman monarchy. During a war campaign against the Rutuli, you might remember them as the people of Turnus, Aeneas' opponent in the Aeneid, the young noblemen in the king's army started discussing their wives as a way to pass the time. Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus boasted that his wife, Lucretia, was the best and most dedicated of spouses. To prove such a claim, the men paid surprise visits to their wives, discovering that all of them were enjoying themselves in their absence, except for Lucretia, who was engaged in domestic activities. Upon seeing her, Sextus, the son of the king, was taken up with desire for her. He approached her some days later, begging her to give herself to him. Lucretia refused, and refused again, until Sextus threatened to kill her and put her in bed with a slave, thus staining hers and her husband's reputation. At this point, Lucretia yielded, and Sextus abused her. When he departed, Lucretia called for her father and her husband, and accused Sextus of having raped her. Then, before her father and her husband could stop her, she stabbed herself, in order to spare her husband the suspicion that she had betrayed him. This was the last straw, not just for Collatinus, who had just lost his wife, but for all the Roman people. Tarquinius the Proud and his family had taken things too far. Collatinus, along with his father-in-law and 2 friends, Lucius Junius Brutus, who was also the king's nephew, and Publius Valerius, swore an oath to expel the king and his family from Rome. Brutus took the matter directly to the people, inflaming public sentiment with a tale of Lucretia's rape and her tragic death. The people answered in kind and revolted. Tullia, the queen, fled the city, losing herself in history. Sextus was forced to escape the lynching mob, only to find his end at the hands of the Gabii, the people he had betrayed. Tarquinius the Proud, the last king of Rome, was stripped of his imperium by the Senate and forced to flee the city. He would try to get everything back once again, but this is a story for another time. Tired of living under the whims of a king, the Roman people thought it was time for a change. They decided they wanted to be governed by 2 consuls elected by the people, holding her power jointly. The first 2 chosen were Brutus and Collatinus. And so ends the monarchy in Rome, For the following 500 years, the 2 consuls a year would govern the city in the name of the people. It would take a man of Julius Caesar's caliber to shake the system, and another great man like Octavian to change the asset of Rome's government once again. We will get there, because it's there that this path will end. But first, we'll meet the heroes of the Republic, the people who have given life and limbs, in one case quite literally a hand, to bring honor and greatness to Rome. As this long episode comes to a close, we're still not sure whether the 7 kings of Rome existed or not. I will leave this question open to you, my fellow travelers. You can decide on your own whether you want them to be real or just simply myth of an ancient time. I invite you once again to join me on my Instagram channel, The Apple and the Hero. And when you do, really, please say hi. I am very, very happy to make your acquaintance. As always, all the research and the writing for this episode has been done by me, Sara Orfali, Doctor in History. Goodbye for now. Safe travels.